we go. Hello and welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, program number 9 in our series, The Gospel According to Mark. We are in chapter 2, going to be beginning with verse 18 on a section called A Question About Fasting. Fasting, very interesting idea. A lot of confusion about what fasting really is. We find the first mention of it in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 27, in the section talking about the Day of Atonement. Now we know that in Leviticus 23 is the story of the 7 feasts of Israel, Passover and Pentecost and all of the rest. But there were really only 6 feasts because one of them was a fast. That's the Day of Atonement. Now here is where we get this idea from. Leviticus 23:27. It shall be for you a time of holy convocation, and you shall afflict yourselves. Now you say, I didn't hear the word fast. No, because it's in the word afflict. The idea is afflict was to deny yourself food and maybe food and drink. So that's where it started with. Once a year, at the time of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, have a day of fasting and repenting of sin. And so we have repenting of sin and afflicting or fasting tied together. There's a lot of confusion about fasting. We know that Jesus fasted. We find that in Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus was pushed by the Holy Spirit out into the wilderness, and the devil showed up, and Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, it says. I won't touch the certain elements of that, but we find that fast there. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught his disciples how to pray, but also how to fast. In fact, the two sections are back to back. Let me read what Jesus said about fasting in the Sermon on the Mount. And this is in Matthew chapter 6, beginning at verse 16. And when you fast, that's how he is telling his disciples, and when you fast, so he understands that they assumes that they will fast. Do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head with oil, and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. First, the idea there's no reward for looking spiritual and pious. That you get noticed and people will say, oh, what a holy man, how pious, how wonderful. Must be a very pure person. Well, that's the reward, getting the approval and praise of other people. So Jesus deals with this real problem that was very common, that people would make a show of it. The Pharisees did this kind of thing. They made a show of their fasting. They wanted to be seen by other people. They did it with prayer as well. We know this from other passages in the New Testament. During Jesus' day, the Jewish people particularly fasted on Monday and Thursday. Interesting. Monday and Thursday, they would have a time of fasting. Now, we don't really know exactly the character and makeup of that sort of fasting, whether it was just during the daylight hours, whether it was a 24-hour thing, what part of the day we don't know, and how extreme was the fasting. Was it from solid foods only? Was it for drink as well? We don't have that kind of information that is clear enough to be able to present. And I certainly in my studies did not come upon any real answer about what fasting looked like in that day. We also know that the Qumran community, the Essene people who lived out in the desert, and they had times of fasting. We find this in the Manual of Discipline that has been discovered, and they talked about the fact that they fasted. John the Baptist, we're going to find out, his disciples fasted, and perhaps it is a link of John the Baptist to that Essene or Qumran community. Not certain about that, but there seems to be something to that. Now, what would be in the mind of a person who was fasting? Why would they do it? Well, one of the reasons was for mourning, and that's why I say that first of all, because John the Baptist's disciples may have been fasting out of mourning for John the Baptist. That's been suggested by some scholars. Probably not the real reason, though. But fasting because of mourning, fasting because of repenting of sin. Another idea that they were fasting in order to have visions. And we know that this is characteristic in forms of shamanism. The vision quest is often accompanied by fasting. So that is also a potential element as to why they would fast. There's another reason, too, that they fasted was because of a dire need. Let's say they needed rain, or they needed food, or they felt threatened by an enemy. They would fast in order to appeal to God for help. So these are some of the reasons why the ancient people and people today will fast. So we have another passage that we find in the Old Testament that relates to fasting just before we get our passage in Mark 2, and that we find in Isaiah chapter 58, because the prophet Isaiah talked a great deal about fasting, or at least in a couple of different sections, and I'm going to look at one in Isaiah chapter 58, verse 3, goes all the way down to through verse 7. So here's what is being said, and this is kind of God asking this through Isaiah. Why have we fasted and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? Because in the context you get that they were doing that to receive something. Then the answer comes, behold, in the day of your fast you seek your own pleasure and oppress all your workers. So there was something unethical and immoral about their fasting. Then in verse 4 it says, behold, you fast only to quarrel and fight, and to hit with the wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. So God is pointing out to them that your fasting, what fasting had become by the 8th century BC, was far less than what God would want. Then in verse 5, we have a series of questions and answers. So, first, this question. Is such the fast that I choose for a person to humble himself? The answer is no, because they're doing it to be seen. Second question. Is it to bow down his head like a reed and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? No. Well, that was what people would do. They would go out in the city of Jerusalem, put out their sackcloth, or cover their heads with it, throw ashes up in the air, and this was a sign of grief and in mourning and fasting. You're not eating, you're afflicting yourself. Okay, is that what he chooses? The answer would be, of course, no. Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? Again, the answer is no. Now, in verse 6 and 7, we find what a fast is about. Here's what it is. Is not this the fast that I choose to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Now, there are a lot of points here that really deserve some lengthy treatment and comment, but we haven't got the time to do that. But we see that the fast was intended, yes, to break the bonds of wickedness, to repent of sin, to humble yourself before God. But it had a social dimension, a strong social dimension, which was to deny yourself physically, materially, and give to those people who didn't have what they needed. So we find this information that had been in existence by the time of Jesus' day for some 7 to 8 centuries. So now we come to our passage of Scripture, Mark chapter 2, verse 18. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. So Mark introduces us to that particular thing. And people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Why? Here comes the why question. Do you ever notice how dangerous a why question is? No one really likes to have said to them, why? I suggest that it's a word to be dropped under most circumstances from our vocabulary at all, because it's simply going to set up a tension. It's going to set up a divide. It's a blaming statement. Why did you do that? And this is what happened. They're watching Jesus. They're watching to see what he does. And they're taking advantage of certain circumstances where they can accuse him. You know, there was an antagonism that they had of Jesus. They were offended. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2, in a couple of different verses, talks about the offense of the gospel. The message of Jesus is offensive. I've never heard anybody or talked to anybody who, upon hearing the message of Jesus and the cross, liked it. It is offensive, and we don't know why. There's no real clear reason why we do that. You might hear of strange and wild things concerning other religious teachings, and not really react about it. You might think that's really kooky, that's really strange, but something happens when the message of Jesus is told to many people. There is an offense. I experienced it. I've been in ministry for a long time, and I have seen it on many thousands of occasions. And if you'd ask the person, why are you building a wall between you and Jesus Christ, and people often won't be able to say why exactly, other than they think Christians are crazy and the church is scandalous and so on and so forth. But there's an antagonism to Jesus, and this is what these people had, and they were looking for every opportunity to accuse him and find something wrong with him, and here they thought maybe they got something on this fasting issue. So, here we go. So this is the issue. So they say, why? John the Baptist's disciples fast, yours don't. The Pharisees fast, and we know that they're very pure and very holy. So you got all these wonderful people are fasting, but you don't fast. Now, there was no real reason that Jesus needed to have fasted. There was the traditional Monday and Thursday fast. There was the Day of Atonement fast. We don't know a great deal about what they really looked like, but Jesus and his disciples weren't doing it. However, we know that in the Sermon on the Mount, he does address fasting. Now, the issue is, we don't know if this situation here occurred before the Sermon on the Mount. most commentators say that this occurred before the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus would, at the appropriate time, teach his disciples both about prayer and fasting. Now, that little phrase I say intentionally, prayer and fasting, because in some versions of the Bible, these words are linked. And I'm going to give you a little something that may frustrate and irritate some people. But I'd love to clear up this issue about prayer and fasting. Anyway, we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so here we have this question. He says, and notice, but your disciples do not fast. So Jesus says to them in verse 19, Jesus says to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? Now, the obvious answer is no. He goes on to say, as long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. Notice he says, not just they don't fast, they cannot fast. Okay, so what does he mean, the bridegroom? Here we have a reference to the Jewish wedding ceremony. And this is in reference to the wedding itself, and this is to the celebration that accompanied the wedding. It might last for a day, 2 days. It might last a whole week, depending on the wealth of the individuals. Could they sustain that kind of celebration? But it was a celebration. So Jesus, and we know, identifies himself as the bridegroom, and in this case, the disciples, which there may be 5 of them, there may be 7 of them. We don't know exactly which disciples were there. We figure Peter and Andrew, James and John were there, and there's this question about Nathaniel and so on. But anywhere from 5 to 7 of the disciples were present at that point. And so they're celebrating. The bridegroom is there. The church is the bride. The church at that point was just these 5 or 7 guys. That's it. That was the extent of the church at that point. They're not going to fast because the bridegroom's there. Okay, that's important to understand. Jesus is going to give 3 reasons why they don't fast. 3 reasons. And this is the first, and in my view, the most important. But he says the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. He says there will be a time when there will be fasting. Now, you say, what day was that? Are they referring to now, that in what we call the church era, where Jesus is not physically present, that the bridegroom is not physically present, that this will be a time of fasting? Maybe that's what they mean. But there's a passage in John's Gospel, chapter 16, and it's a long passage. I'm only going to read 2 verses of it. But in John 16, beginning with 16, here's what Jesus said. A little while, and you will see me no longer, and again a little while, and you will see me. He's talking about his being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, the trial, the crucifixion, and then the resurrection. Now, skipping down to verse 20, so I'm going to skip verses 17, 18, 19. Here's verse 20. Truly I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. He's talking about the difference between the crucifixion and the resurrection. A time of mourning. The disciples ran away. They were fearful. They thought, after years of being with Jesus, seeing all that he did, hearing all that he taught, they were there. They found it impossible when Jesus was telling them that he was going to be crucified. They would not believe it. They could not believe it. They did not believe it. They were absolutely shocked when he was arrested, and more so when he was crucified. They mourned. And remember, that is one of the things about the fast. Perhaps they did literally fast during that period. We don't know. But this, in my opinion, is what Jesus is talking about here in verse 20 in Mark 2, when he says, and then they will fast in that day. So that's one of the reasons why his disciples are not fasting, because he's present with them. He's present with them. Okay. So, then the next reason he gives is verse 21. He says, and no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Now, we live in a day, this shirt, we used to, when I was a kid, we used the term sans-forise. I think that's what it was. It meant pre-shrunk. The cloth that was be used to make garments had already been washed, had been shrunk. They didn't have the capacity to do that otherwise, to make cloth not shrinkable. So it shrank. So if you had a garment you were wearing and it developed a hole and you want to patch it, you would have to patch it with something that had already been washed and shrunk, because it was just going to make a bigger tear than if you did that. So you see the problem. You can't do it. They don't fast for the same reason. It doesn't work. He says, if he does, the patch tears away from the new, from the old, and a worse tear is made. Okay, so that's the second reason. And it's a little obscure, not as straightforward as this next one, but it just meant it's something you don't do. My disciples don't fast. They don't need to. It's a mistake. It would be a mistake to do that. Just imagine if Jesus had come along and said, you have to obey all the minutiae laws about everything, about the Sabbath, which we're going to be looking at next week, the idea of Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath. What if Jesus had taught his disciples, hey, you got to obey all 234 of the prohibitions against work on the Sabbath? Too much rules, regulations, over the top, can't do this, forget it, I'm walking. It would just been another system of ritualistic, legalistic religion that nobody could bear with anyway. Nobody could put up with it. So Jesus says, that's not going to happen. It's not going to be like those days. Now, the next thing he says, the third reason why he and his disciples don't fast, verse 22, and no one puts new wine in old wineskins. If he does, that if, both these ifs are first-class conditions, meaning the statement is true. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins, but new wine is for fresh wineskins. The church is the new wineskin. What happened is, in the fermenting process, let's say a deer skin, it's going to expand, it's going to impact the leather, the deer skin, it's going to stretch it, and after a while it's going to become brittle. Now if you put new wine in and that fermenting process goes on, the skin's going to burst, it'll be too stretched, it'll be too much for it, the weight of the new wine and the fermenting process, and the skin will be lost, which was valuable for water, and the wine was going to be lost too. So, of course, you don't do that. And this is what it would have been like if Jesus has taught his disciples to fast. Now, fasting. Now, let me talk a little bit about that. With some of my old friends, I've talked about fasting and the passages of Scripture where it talks about the fasting and fasting and prayer. When Jesus went up in the mountain, he came down Mount of Transfiguration, and a man had brought his son to have a demon cast out the disciples, and he couldn't. And the King James Version has Jesus saying, "These do not come out by anything but prayer and fasting." And there is another passage in Mark 9:29, where we have the same thing, prayer and fasting. And in Acts 10:30 about Cornelius's prayer and fasting. And in 1 Corinthians 7:5, Paul talks about prayer and fasting. The only problem is, in the best and earliest manuscripts, the word fasting is not even there. In fact, in Matthew 17:21 is absolutely not even in the new translations. It's in the King James. The King James Version is based on the Textus Receptus that was developed by Erasmus, one of the great scholars, Catholic scholars of his day, and a great scholar, and he produced a textual, a text in the New Testament, but it was not based on anywhere close to the best manuscripts. They had yet, were centuries, they hadn't been discovered yet. And those passages that mention prayer and fasting, the fasting is simply not in the text. If it were not so, I would not say that. Guaranteed. It was a long time before I realized that. But when those new manuscripts came out, fasting was a way in which they dealt with things. It was part of it. Now, I would say this. I'm going to ask Katie to put something up on the screen now. Pretty quick, at our Miller Avenue Church, we're going to have two classes that we're going to teach: church history and Islamic studies. Church history and Islamic studies. The church history is going to be at 10 o'clock from 10 to 11, and Katie is going to be teaching church history. And then at 11 to 12, I'm going to be teaching Islamic studies. It's our Saturday seminary, no tuition. You'll have to buy a book, but that's about it. It starts on Saturday, September 19 from 10 to noon. That's all. And it is vital that Christians understand church history. If you don't understand church history, it is very difficult to understand so much of Christianity. You have no idea where these things come from. And of course, we're going to be working on Islamic studies. You're going to love it. I've already finished my new book on Islamic studies, and I think you'll find it very valuable. So I wanted to get that in. Give me a call, email me, and there's no pre-registration necessary. You just show up. We'll have a good time with that. Now, I want to say what I think that the real fast is. Here's what the real Christian fast is. We do have a fast that we observe, and I think we find it most clearly in Mark chapter 8, verse 34. Listen to this. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. The word deny himself comes very close to the concept of afflict, comes very close to the idea of the fast. This is the fast that we do. It is not one of mourning. It is denying ourselves and taking up the cross. So long.